first panel is going to talk about regulation's effect on the national economy. And I know you've all heard figures about, well, the regulations cost somewhere around $2 trillion in a $17 trillion economy. And we don't have exact figures, but that's something like it. One of the things that regulations do to the national economy is, and I mentioned this earlier, they distort resources. They take private resources and they turn them to public purposes. So, for example, you've all heard, well, don't regulations create jobs? There are jobs that, to comply with regulations. Well, what happens with regulations is people lose their jobs, and then we create jobs to comply with regulations. But jobs to do what? That's the question that you want to answer. Are they productive jobs? Are they actually useful jobs? We hear regulation controls unruly market forces. Well, what that also means is it slows down the economy. So let me introduce our distinguished panel. I'll start with Don Boudreau, who's a senior fellow at the Mercatus Center, right here to my left at George Mason University. He's a professor of economics at George Mason University and previously served as the chair of the economics department. He's also one of the best economic communicators that I know. So you should read Don Boudreau in the Wall Street Journal and listen to his blogs and so forth. Doug Holtz-Eakin is president of the American Action Forum, and Doug has held several prominent government posts, including director of the Congressional Budget Office. And Bill Beach, who most of you all probably know, he's the chief economist on the Senate Committee on the Budget. So with that, let me get out of the way and let Bill take it over.
As I look out here, I'm struck by how much the regulatory burden, the burden of analysis is in your futures. I think what we as staff have to look forward to, I'm not looking forward to it as much as you guys are going to be looking forward to it, is how much regulatory analysis is going to dominate our work. It already does. It does for me, and I'm sure it does for you as well. This analysis is going to start with advice to our bosses about the impact, the effect of regulation. Probably it's economic and social, but as you heard from Matt, it moves, I think, and it will move to the constitutional and political. And I think definitely what Matt said is something to meditate on, and that probably the theme of the conference, that we need to drive, and that you will drive, regulations back into politics. And what I think that means concretely is that when we open up the Budget and Impoundment Act of 1974 for reform this summer and the summer next, that's kind of the schedule, that you should look forward to a regulatory budget title being introduced. And if that's the case, then you'll be doing annual budgeting of regulations with perhaps budget pay-go, and now your futures are very complicated with regulations. If you don't understand regulations, you won't be able to give budgetary advice, you won't know what the budget pay-go is, you won't know what the costs are. Let me predict that in 10 years you'll be doing more regulatory analysis than tax analysis. We're shrinking the tax base and we're broadening the regulatory effects. So from a staff-to-staff standpoint, pay close attention. If you're looking for a career path and you think it's in tax analysis or spending or welfare, you're probably off track already. It's probably in regulation in some fashion or another. And with that note, I'd like to turn this over to my good friend Don Boudreau. And Don and Doug, you can talk from there or you can talk from here, whatever makes you most comfortable. At the end of the presentations, which are going to be about 12 to 15 minutes long, I'll ask a few questions. During that period, you should be queuing up your questions because then I'll ask you to ask those questions. Don?
Given that I can talk from here, I'll do so because actually later in my talk, in a few moments, I'll need a platform, and this is a better platform than that one. So I'm an economist. I'm going to talk more about the economics of regulation. Most critics of government regulation focus on the different incentives that regulators face, and most analysis from economists focus on the incentives that regulators face compared to the incentives faced by consumers, private businesses, and investors. This focus on incentives, I think, is important. It's yielded a great deal of insight into both the effects of regulations and the reasons why the regulatory state grows. Here, however, I'm going to focus on a less studied issue, but one that I think is no less important, and that's the knowledge problem that swirls around regulatory efforts. Even if we assume that all the incentives faced by government regulators are as ideal as they can possibly be in this human veil of ours, regulators still confront the challenge of gathering sufficient knowledge and information to regulate in the public interest. This knowledge problem has multiple layers, so I'm going to look at these from least, or most obvious to maybe least obvious. So most obviously, regulators, even the best intentioned and smartest ones, cannot possibly know the preferences and risk tolerances of each of the individuals whose lives they regulate. It's trite but true to say that individuals are diverse. We're all different in our tastes and our preferences and our tolerances for risk. And none of us can read minds. So one of the most crucial pieces of knowledge necessary for regulation genuinely in the public interest, getting the risk-reward trade-off right for the people whose lives are regulated, that's a piece of knowledge that in principle can't be known by regulators. They can guess, but they can't know it. But even if knowledge of the millions of different individuals' tastes and risk preferences should somehow be gathered and known by regulators, this knowledge cannot be used correctly or scientifically in any meaningful sense. The reason is that government regulation is, by its nature, or almost by its nature, a one-size-fits-all arrangement. It's practically impossible to craft government regulations to account for the diversity of different tastes and preferences. The risk-tolerant woman who would prefer to enjoy the pain relief of some prohibited drug is not allowed to do so, even if in her estimation, her tolerance for risk, the value of the pain relief outweighs for her the risk of damage to her body done by the prohibited drug. She's simply unable to use that drug because the FDA regulators prohibited it. Put differently, even with full and accurate knowledge of each individual's taste and risk preferences, there's no one correct maximum level of risk that is socially acceptable, unless, of course, everyone in America has the same exact level of tolerance for risk and taste, which is practically absurd. So here I'm talking really not so much of a knowledge problem as I am of an impossibility problem. Contrary to popular belief, there is simply no way to aggregate the preferences of multiple people, certainly not hundreds of millions of people, into some correct collective preference that defines the preferences of the collective. Such a collective preference doesn't exist. It's sort of like a flying horse. We can imagine it, we can draw pictures of it, but the thing doesn't exist in reality, and in fact, it's impossible to exist in reality. Nevertheless, if there is to be some government regulation, some cutoff level of riskiness must be chosen for each regulated product or activity. How much risk is permissible in birth control pills? How much in medications for hypertension? How safe should minivans be? Sports cars, hang gliders? What level of information disclosure is minimally acceptable for publicly traded corporations? These questions seem like scientific questions that in principle have correct and objective answers. But again, they're not. This is, I think, the point that Matt Spaulding was making about making things political. These are political questions. They are not scientific questions. There is no correct answer. It's a matter of political debate and give and take. Parenthetically, this isn't the place to go into the matter, but for those of you who are interested, you can check out the work of the American Nobel Prize-winning economist Kenneth Arrow, who proved that any attempt at such aggregation is indeed impossible. It's called Arrow's impossibility theorem. It's not unlikely, it's not difficult, it's impossible. There is no collective preference that we can identify scientifically. Yet another knowledge problem, one of a very different sort, is that of unintended consequences. We humans vastly overestimate our ability to foretell the future, and we're also too prone to assume that results emerge from intentions. Of course, the law of unintended consequences is well known and gets spoken of often. Our minds are simply too puny to predict the full range of consequences that our actions will yield. This truth, I think, counsels keeping actions as decentralized as possible. I mentioned just now briefly one among many infamous examples of the law of unintended consequences, the locked cockpit door on the German wings aircraft. reducing passengers' risks of being killed by a terrorist breaking into an airliner's cockpit wound up increasing passengers' risks of being killed by a mad pilot locked alone in the cockpit. This tragedy in the French Alps doesn't prove by any means that the regulation was bad. It still might be worth its costs, but it does show that it's nearly impossible to foresee all the potential downsides of a regulation. There's an even deeper knowledge problem. I'm looking for a good name for it. One that we might tentatively call the problem of the immensity of possible combinations. This problem arises because the stricter is regulation, the smaller is the scope of permissible exchanges and activities. And the smaller is the scope of permissible exchanges and activities, the fewer will be the chance combinations of ideas, resources, people, and activities that produce positive new benefits. It's important to understand just how great is the amount of knowledge constantly in use in a successful economy daily. It's an amount so vast that no human being or committee of geniuses could possibly hope to begin to gather in a single place, much less to process and to act upon productively. Economists are rightly fond of pointing out that the production of even the simple commercial grade pencil requires an amount of knowledge that's far larger than any human mind or committee of human minds could hold and process. I teach a principles of economics class every semester at George Mason, and one of the things I do at the beginning of class is tell this famous pencil story, at least famous to economists. And pencil is one of the most mundane things, of course, in modern society. I tell a true story. I'm 56 years old. I've used pencils all my life. I never remember buying a pencil. They just like exist. They're just like around, right? And but it's true to say, literally, no one knows how to make a pencil. The amount of knowledge that it takes to make a simple pencil is vast. The amount of knowledge to make a simple pencil includes not only knowing what kind of wood is used, knowing what's in the center of the pencil, it includes the knowledge of how to make the chainsaw or the axe that chop down the tree. It includes the knowledge of how to transport all these materials to a central factory. It includes the knowledge of how to make the aluminum processing plant that generates the aluminum that holds the eraser onto the shaft of the pencil. It includes a huge amount of knowledge, and yet markets solve this problem, not perfectly by any means, but reasonably well, daily. And of course, what's true for a pencil is true for nearly everything that we have in our modern society. If you think a pencil's complicated, think of something really extraordinary, like a Toyota Camry. So one lesson to draw from this pencil story is that the economy is far more complex than it seems on casual observation. This fact is no proof that government regulation is undesirable or impossible. It should, however, caution against the notion that regulators, if only they're diligent or smart enough, can comprehend all of the knowledge at work in an industry or in an economy. The complexity of the economy is far greater than it appears to our observing eyes. To drive this point home, the point of this complexity, the reality of this complexity, and the importance of allowing great freedom of entrepreneurs and consumers to choose as they wish rather than as a central authority dictates, consider the simple mathematical fact. When I first heard this, I didn't believe it. You may have heard it, but I find it still astonishing. If I have 3 items, I was telling someone just before I needed a prop, so I grabbed a bottle of water, even though I'm not really thirsty. I have coffee, a coffee cup, and I have my wallet. So if I ask you how many different ways in a single dimension can I arrange 3 different items? I have the bottle of water first, the coffee cup, my wallet. I'm going to go to my wallet. Don't take my wallet. My wallet, bottle of water, the coffee cup. Right? There are 6 different ways. It's a simple mathematical formula. It's called X Factorial. You see it on your scientific calculator. It's X with an exclamation point. The exclamation point actually is very meaningful because it's a pretty stunning result. The mathematical formula is you take the number and you just do a downward multiplication. 3 items, 3 times 2 times 1. That's 6. If I had 4 items, it's 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. That's 24. So if I have 20 different items, a mere 20 items, there are many more than 20 items in this room, and I ask how many different ways can you arrange 20 different items? The number is, I'm not going to read it, it has no name, but it is, to give you a sense of how big it is, the number of different ways to arrange 20 different items in a single dimension, just a mere 20 items, is about equal to the number of seconds, as in seconds in an hour and hours in a day. Number of seconds there are in 80 billion years. That's longer than the history of the life of the universe. The number of seconds in 80 billion years. Now think of the economy we live in. It doesn't have 20 different items. It has billions of different items. it's an inconceivably big number when we consider how many different resource combinations there are. The relevance of this mathematical reality is that it helps to understand this mathematical reality, is that it helps us to better see the enormously complex problems that markets solve every day. A successful economy is one that finds among all possible combinations the relatively few useful ones that work, combinations that feed the people well, that house them securely, that clothe them warmly, that supply all other demands at reasonable costs. Doing so requires a careful combination of resources, yet surely no single individual mind can choose from such a large possible number of combinations the ones that are best. We have to rely upon decentralized trial and error. By securing that careful combination, it's not as easy as it seems. With literally billions of resources, the number of possible combinations, again, is staggeringly large. Most of these combinations, by the way, would be either useless, me with a scientific calculator employed by an engineering firm, or calamitous, me holding a scalpel, getting ready to perform brain surgery on you. Right? That would be a really disastrous combination. You certainly wouldn't like that combination, and I wouldn't, because I would be sued for medical malpractice. So how do we ensure that most of the combinations of resources work? Again, one key is decentralization, which encourages lots of experimentation. Another key is to have these many experimental contests decided by the people who have the most skin in the game, namely consumers who are spending their own money and private businesses and investors who are spending their own money and time. Only by providing maximum possible scope to entrepreneurs, each with his own unique bits of knowledge, to experiment freely with different combinations of resources, and having the ultimate test being consumer satisfaction as revealed by consumer willingness to pay, do we maximize the amount of knowledge used to promote genuine economic growth. Government regulation, however necessary it might be in certain circumstances, always risks stymieing this decentralized competitive process. Thanks.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much for the chance to be here today. I'm going to make three very simple points in the discussion. The first is that the regulatory burden is quite large, and I'm going to walk through some of the recent trends in that. Second point I'm going to make is to elaborate on the ways that regulation interferes with the functioning of an economy, harms its growth, and also that these costs of regulations are ultimately borne by consumers in very specific ways, and you can't lose track of who's really footing the bill for regulation. This is not something that comes out of a vacuum. And then lastly, I'll close with just a plea that you keep your eye on regulatory reform just as much as you keep your eye on tax reform and other issues that face us. So how big is the regulatory burden? Here I want to do some shameless self-promotion. In your packets you have this collection of charts. These come from the American Nations Forum's Regulation Rodeo, which is an online database available to you at regradio.com. Its genesis was the work of Sam Batkins, who's been at AAF for 5 years, and his colleague Dan Goldbeck, and some interns. And they read the Federal Register and supporting materials every single day on every single regulation and rule that the federal government promulgates. And then the interns die, and we get new interns, and then they collect the data and distribute it. And we now have it in a form that you can use and investigate the regulatory burden and organize it by year. If you look in here, you can see some what years things happen. You can organize it by bill. We have the Affordable Care Act, Dodd-Frank, the gifts that keep giving in the regulatory world. You can organize it by committee of jurisdiction. You're working for someone on a committee, you can look at what's in your area and what's going on. And so this is a resource that allows you to get a feel for the scale of activity in the regulatory world. And I promise you, the scale is quite large. If you look at what's happened since 2008, and you take the agency's word, don't second guess, just say, they say this rule or regulation will cost X, just take them at their word. They say 2 million, you say 2 million, and just add those up. All right, and this is hardly what I would call a comprehensive economic measure of the cost of regulation. Just add up the self-reported compliance costs. It's about $100 billion a year. Now, I promise you that if we had passed a tax bill that raised taxes $100 billion a year or $1 trillion over the 10-year budget window, everybody would know about it. And everybody would say, oh my God, what's that doing to the economy? But we've gotten the equivalent burden imposed through the regulatory system, and I would say the average American's blissfully unaware of the damage this could be doing to the economy. And so keeping track of these seemingly small rules, regulations, and adding them up is an important task, and one that we certainly will continue to do, but you should have on your radar screen, because it is something that's damaging the way this economy performs in a deep and significant way. And some of the recent activity has been enormous. There are things called major rules, those which are going to have a larger than $100 million impact on the private economy. 2010 saw a record for the number of major rules put out, and there were 100 of them that year. And in addition to the compliance costs, there's a paperwork burden. They keep track of how many hours of paperwork are involved with every rule. Right now, there are a bit over 9,200 government forms that take about 10 billion paperwork hours. So that imagine valuing that at the average wage in the economy. You have an enormous bill in terms of time spent just complying with these regulations. And as with taxes, when you have such a regulation, someone's going to pay for it. And it's important to always think through who really pays for a regulation. So think of one of the favorite regulations in recent years, the regulation that the minimum wage be $10.10 an hour. Who foots the bill for raising the minimum wage? Well, usually it's portrayed as McDonald's, and they've got piles of money, and so, or Walmart, and the Walmarts are really rich, so what's to worry about? But if you think through a little bit, raising the cost of employing labor has some real impacts on the way business operates. Number one, it will probably not hire someone who is currently unemployed. And so that person will in part bear the cost of the higher minimum wage because they are not going to get a job they otherwise would have gotten. It's a pretty perverse thing to do. Second thing is, we're going to essentially redistribute income from people who have a job to people who have a job away from people who don't have a job. It's a very strange way to pursue anti-poverty programs. Second thing you'll have to do is probably, raise prices for consumers. So the average hamburger price is going to go up, and the purchasers are going to pay the cost of that regulation, not McDonald's. Or it could be that some mom and pop store can't really raise their prices very much. They really can't cut back too much, so they'll end up just earning less, and it'll come out of the owner's return to their business. But it'll come out of somewhere. Someone will bear that cost. In addition to there always being someone bearing the cost, the regulation changes the way the business operates. And there's a clear incentive here by making labor more expensive to do something else. Right? Let's automate this, shift toward a more capital-intensive way of fast food, have don't have clerks. No one has clerks anymore, right? ATMs take care of your banking. You check yourself in at the airlines. You can do all your ordering through an automated system at a McDonald's, and we'll just get rid of the folks at the counter. Those incentives will play out as a result of this. And with higher prices, you'll shift from the fast food industry to something else for your food. So the regulation is going to have a profound ripple effect through the economy. Someone's going to end up being poorer as a result of it, even when it's supposed to make people better off, and it's going to change the way the economy is organized. And as Don mentioned, it was organized in a very sensible way to begin with because it had hundreds of millions of people checking whether they liked the organization, and now we've upset it. And we've made it a less productive economy that is less well suited to meet the needs of the population. So these are the things to keep track of, and they're not in the abstract. If you sort of go through and start looking at the impact on prices, the last slide in this piece of propaganda has a little chart. I mean, look at 2014 alone. We're talking about CAFE. If you look at fuel efficiency standards and what it takes to make a car satisfy those, you're talking about making the car lighter with more expensive materials. You're talking about changing fundamentally the way the engine is and retooling it. This is an expensive process. Costs another $3,100 per car. I can assure you the auto manufacturers put that right into the sticker price, and everybody in America pays it. Household products, about $1,600. Add up all the things that happened. Dodd-Frank says you can't just do mortgages the way we used to. We have a qualified residential mortgage. We have a qualified mortgage. We have standards for the processing of mortgages. It's another $360 a year for everyone who goes and gets a mortgage. Right? That's just sitting out there. Same thing. All the energy regulations and EPA regulations we've seen in recent years, raising your utility costs by about $130 a year. So we're taking this straight out of the pockets of every American, including some of the least affluent Americans, in a very disguised and not very transparent way. So that, in the end, is the burden of the regulation. It's not the self-reported compliance costs. It's the fact that when the regulations imposed on the economy, we get it arranged in a less efficient way. We've interfered with the natural functioning of the market. We're depressing the return to investment. We're taking money that would have been a profitable investment and making it less so we don't invest as much, we don't grow. If you regulate very tightly, there are fewer ways that you can innovate, and technological growth and innovation has been the core of U.S. economic success over its entire economic history, and the regulatory burden threatens those in ways that are very hard to measure, but very, very real. All of those are reasons why it is useful to check anything that's going on, not just for what the statutory language might say, but what the future regulatory burden might be, and I encourage you to do that. Last thing I'd say is, we're due for regulation reform. There's going to be a lot of discussions about this. Bill mentioned the possibility of a regulatory budget. Other countries have done things like this. The United Kingdom, for example, put in a rule that said for every new regulation, 2 have to go away, right? 1 in, 2 out, try to reduce the regulatory burden. Anything that more broadly requires benefit cost analysis at the front end, however imperfect it may be, trying to find out if regulations make sense is a good thing to do. Anything that for the first time looks back and in a retrospective way systematically asks the question, is this still a good idea? And gets rid of those things that flunk that test. And anything that has a consequence for failing to do the benefit cost either prospectively or retrospectively would improve the regulatory state in the United States. We simply don't have consequences for failing to do good benefit cost analysis. It's just there's no penalty out there. So we need to get all those things into the mix in the U.S. So you have a lot of work ahead of you. Good luck, and thank you for the chance to talk.
Well, that was excellent. Thank you so much.